With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. So welcome everyone to this session of study of Omniscient Jigme Lingpa's Treasury of Precious Qualities. And we're presently within the chapter on how to apply our Bodhisattva vow, where we look at the two kinds of bodhicitta that you could say constitute relative bodhicitta, which is the bodhicitta of aspiration, the wish to accomplish enlightenment in order to benefit all sentient beings, and then the bodhicitta of action or application, which is about us actually doing it. And that's where we're looking at the 6 paramitas. Now, the 6 paramitas, they actually develop, you could say, in a gradual way. They are increasingly subtle. The 6 paramita begin with generosity, which is something that we can all do. And what the paramitas intend to do is take us beyond a habitual fixation on self. Now, self is all around us. It sort of permeates us, but it's also very much you could say, the nature of our confusion. But it's very pervasive. And it's where we say, my body, my mind, my pride, my trauma, my history, my future, my. And then we have in relation to that other, the others, out there. And we have, curiously, a very strong division, but the thing is, the other is continually experienced within our mind. The way that we see others is constructed with our mind. The way that we see the world is different from how other people see it. So we each actually walk around with our own construction of other. And yet we have this curious belief that the other is out there solidly as something external to us. And that's where the Buddha has something to say. The Buddha points out that even though we think in terms of this unitary I, we actually cannot find anything that's unitary at all. Not only are we both mind, something entirely intangible, as well as body, but each of these, both the mind and the body, are so many different things. And yet we seem to think that there's something unitary. We seem to think there's something permanent, unchanging, unconditional. The thing is, if we begin to analyze, of course, but without analysis, yes, that's definitely there's no point in denying that. But if we begin to analyze, then we can see that actually that solidity that we attribute to ourselves and to others, if we analyze, we cannot find that owner of self, of our being, that self. And similarly with other. Now, what the Buddha is really encouraging us is to simply just look. The Buddha is not saying you have to believe in this, you have to do anything other than the Buddha just wants us to look. But the Buddha does have something to say. And what the Buddha wants us to do is so that we no longer suffer. Because as long as we are held by these strong beliefs in I, then there's all the drama around me getting what I want, me not getting what I want, me getting what I want and then losing it again. Me, and then similarly also the others that are out there that we sometimes think of in terms of other people, but also other things that are external to us. And the Buddha can see that we suffer a lot from this. And this is where we have the whole predicament of what we call samsara. What the Buddha wants to do is end our confusion. And that's where the Buddha's message is really simply try and look, because what we're suffering from is essentially we're suffering from ignorance in the sense of we're ignoring our reality. Ignorance, as we normally think of it, means that we don't know something. But here we can also add to that actually the being actively ignoring, actively not looking. So what we're doing on the path of Dharma is really just looking at the nature of things. So that's where I remember Woolston was quoting one scholar saying the entire message of the Buddha's teaching is to understand what phenomena are, understanding the nature of phenomena. And that's where, of course, we align ourselves also with the natural sciences. That's exactly what science also seeks to do. Where science seeks to do this so that we can have a more comfortable life, it can help the larger community when we know technologies and so on. That's where we have a knowledge tradition that's very much based on trying to understand how we can work with the phenomenal world and what is the phenomenal world made of. And similarly, in the Buddhist teaching, we're also looking at what is our phenomena, but we're particularly looking at it from the point of view of understanding that our phenomena are created by mind, and also that this mind is hallucinating, is creating phenomena that are not real. So that's where we talk about the mind potentially falling into samsara and potentially freeing ourselves from samsara. So in the context of Jigme Lingpa's work, last time we talked about the going into the nature of this what cuts through this, which is what we call wisdom, prajna. And that's where, when we have the paramitas, generosity is the first place where we actually begin to relinquish fixation on self. Because the moment that we're generous, we're actually letting go of something, we're giving something. It's something very beautiful. And then through the paramitas of discipline, patience, energy, and samadhi, then we then arrive at the most subtle practice, actually, you could say, of a form of generosity, which is letting go of our ignorance. And that's where we're presently looking at then the wisdom that cuts through this ignorance. And wisdom here, of course, we sometimes talk about it in terms of something that's cultivated. And it is this intelligence, this prajna that cuts through our confusion, that sees what is and what isn't, that discerning that we then have in the image of Manjushri, the sword, what we call the sword of prajna, that which cuts through our confusion. And what is unveiled is then an underlying disposition that is no longer hindered by ignorance. And that's where we talk about Buddha nature, the qualities of Buddha nature that manifest when we remove what it is that veils this. So on one hand, we're talking about eliminating something. On the other hand, we're talking about discovering something. Now, what we'll look at here is essentially the teachings, the various teachings the Buddha has given in terms of this wisdom nature. But let's have a look at it. And I'm drawing here from the Yogacarya tradition, what we call three natures, which sometimes when it's explained is a bit difficult to grasp. But it needn't be that difficult. I made this little image here, this little illustration here, and I ran it by Kangyur Rinpoche, who sort of said, yes, that's a good way of presenting this issue or the matter of wisdom. And what we refer to in the Buddhist teaching as mind, this that we walk around with, this experience that's with us right here, right now. We're not talking anything philosophical that's beyond what we can experience right now. This mind can flip into samsara and it can be free. So we call it the dependent nature. And it can be veiled when we are then caught in confusion, what we can call inauthentic experience. And it can also be free when we actually discover the natural condition of it, which is nirvana or enlightenment. And that's what we could also call authentic experience. So we have here, if you look on the left side, we have a condition we call samsara. Now, this samsara is really just a place where we're caught up in confusion and we think that things are something they're not. We think there is a solid self. We think there is a solid world of phenomena. And that's where we're going to have to re-educate ourselves, people. I know many people, they would like to come to the Dharma, and the Dharma looks wonderful and the Lamas are terribly nice and so on. And we just like to have some beautiful practices that we do, some nice visualizations, and think of some nice stories, all of wonderful stories from exotic Tibet and so on. But unfortunately, we have to actually deal with where we are right here, right now. And that's where we need to actually work directly with some of our assumptions about the world and about ourselves. That's where there is this practice in the Buddhist teaching where we first need to hear something. We need to take in some information from the Buddha. And that's where we might be reluctant. We might think, oh, can't I just do some practice? You know, I just like to have peace of mind and a bit of compassion and so on. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But if we really want to understand what the Buddha is trying to do, and what the Buddha really wants is to get to the root of our confusion and free us, then we actually need to re-educate ourselves a little bit, or educate ourselves. That's where there's something to be learned here. And that's where we need to appreciate what the Buddha is saying is, right now we're stuck with some assumptions that are not valid. The belief in the way that we exist. And that's where all the Buddha is asking us is really just to investigate. The present condition that we have is, yes, we're stuck in an imaginary nature, in the sense that we're assuming things exist the way that they actually don't. Now, what we do then, and the objective, is that underlying our confusion is actually a place that's not confused. It's just as if we're having a fit. We're having a bout or a passing condition of confusion. We're just, for a short period of time, or a fleeting moment, we're having a fit of samsara. And underneath this condition, we're actually perfectly healthy. And that's all the Buddha wants, is just to get us well again, remove the illness. Kangyur Rinpoche, when teaching refuge, he said the most important thing is actually that we understand that our confusion is removable. Now here in this image, if you look at that, where over here where it says imaginary nature, and then there's sort of a slider here that goes down, that actually is intending to illustrate the practice of the path, meaning eliminating our obscurations or confusion. And when that becomes gradually eliminated, we unveil an underlying condition that we can call Buddha nature, or which is also sometimes called the pure dependent nature. Sometimes we refer to this section over here that's white, we refer to that as the impure dependent nature. And over here where we refer to that as the pure dependent nature. And that's simply just referring to the purity of the mind. Now, sometimes there's some squabbling in Buddhism around whether or not this mind is inherently existent or not. And of course, there's nothing tangible about it, but there is undeniably an experience that is awakening. So that's where, however we choose to describe it, whether it's as something that is truly existent or not, it is an undeniable experience of awakening, enlightenment. And that's why we call this the perfectly existent nature. So that's a little bit what we're doing here. In terms of what we intend with the study of wisdom, is really just to enable us to have an understanding of what it is that this project engages or involves. Simply just moving from the confused imaginary nature to the perfectly existing nature. And that's what we do on the path. So last time, and I'm just going to upload this, in this particular chapter, we're going to be essentially looking at three things. We're going to be looking at the wisdom resulting from hearing the teachings, what we call the wisdom of hearing, then the wisdom of reflection. And that is where we actually need to hear the teaching, And then we need to see, how does that fit into my experience? And my job now is actually to together with, obviously, not my job. This is, luckily you have authoritative people here. You have Jigme Lingpa and Kangyur Rinpoche. But we'd want to walk away from having studied this chapter with a clear sense that this actually has something to do with what we experience. If we're talking about the Vaibhashikas or Sutrantikas, there should be some sense that we actually know what they're talking about. And that's where very often, sometimes when it's explained in the classical context, people are sometimes left a little bit sort of overwhelmed, thinking, "Whoa, that sounds very sophisticated and wonderful." But that's obviously something for scholars. It's not for me. I'm just a practitioner. And that's where I'm afraid we can't get away with that. If we live in this world, we're going to have to know what's north, what's south, what's east, what's west, and so on. We need to know roughly that there's a southern hemisphere and a northern hemisphere, these kind of things. And that's where of course, there's some details that might be sort of, you could say, things that we can leave until later, but a rough idea is very helpful. And that's where, when we sit down to meditate, it's good if we have an idea of what we're doing. And that's where, when we sit down to meditate, good if we have some idea of what it is that causes confusion, what it is that sets us free. And that's what then constitute the wisdom resulting from reflection. And when we have that, then we proceed then to meditate. And meditation is then a radical way of integrating insight. It's not just thinking. It's actually making sure that confusion is clarified, that our ordinarily confused mind becomes less confused, becomes less caught up in thinking about the drama of me and the drama of other. And that's where, with some degree of understanding, we sit down and meditate, and meditation actually frees us. It sets us free. It makes the mind less afflicted. And that's where all the normal engagements with a strong belief in I and a strong belief in other, which results in what we call kleshas, the toxic conditions of the mind, then weakens, because we don't necessarily believe in that sort of solid sense of I and other. And that's where then the toxicity of our mind becomes weaker and weaker. And also this also results in not setting down patterns that drive our particular style of confusion. And that's where we, freeing ourselves from the toxicity of the mind, from the afflictions or the kleshas, this also frees us from this patterning that we call karma, where the acting on the toxic conditions of the mind, it results in us beginning to act on them, and then it becomes part of who we are, and how the way that we you could say, reconstruct ourselves from moment to moment. And that's why we talk about karma as, you do something, it has a result. Now, the good thing about all of this is that this whole situation can be remedied. And that's why then we have the logic of the entire path is, of course, that with wisdom, we can set ourselves free. All right. Thank you for your patience here, hanging in with my rambling. And of course, for many of you, I'm just repeating what you already know. So thank you for your patience. That's, again, opportunity to practice the paramita of patience. And for those of you who are new, or for whom any of this might not be that obvious, please don't hesitate. I'll leave a little bit of time at the end so we can. I'm very grateful. Last time someone mentioned that this is tough, and that's why, yes, it is tough, but it's also very much worth looking into. So please don't hesitate if there is some doubts about what we're saying. So last time we're now talking about the various categories of the teachings. First, with regards to the teachings that we have, what we call the Buddha's teachings, which we then listen to. We try to hear what the Buddha has to say. we're looking at a snake in the road, and the Buddha is saying, hey, it's not really a snake, it's just a rope. And that's where we then say, huh? The Buddha says it's a rope, and then where we actually have to do the looking ourselves. He can't get into our heads and make us understand that this is a rope. We're going to have to do the looking ourselves. But that's where the Buddha says something to us. He says, look. And that's essentially what is implicit in when we talk about the wisdom resulting from hearing the teachings. So that's where we then have a variety of teachings. Some are what we call definitive, some are what we call expedient, and this we covered last time. Some of the kind of teachings that talk about the nature of things as they actually are, definitive teachings. And some are more about the process that enabled us to actually get there, to understand that. And that's more about, you could say, the path. But anyway, that's where we presently are looking at these different categories of the Buddha's teachings. And it's very helpful to know that, because then when we come across the Buddha's teachings, we can have some idea of what the teachings, where they fit in, where they belong. We don't have to feel sort of lost. So here then in verse 116, when it says, the beings might be led upon the path. All objects that appear are analyzed with reasoning and overstated as to their existence. This is the expedient path. To know on which of these two teachings, expedient or definitive, one should rely, is indeed a key that opens up the scriptures. Actually, let me just go back slightly to the previous one, because here the previous line or the previous stanza actually talks about what is the definitive teachings. And that's essentially talking about what we call suchness. The fact that phenomena, ourselves, the phenomenal world, exists without our overlay, our interpretation or elaborations. And that's what we, through the practice of the path, we sort of take away the veils and begin to see the suchness of things without our projections. So that's what we call definitive teachings. But then we have to take into account that our constructs, they exist in different ways. We have different beliefs in how we can approach this, Some might just sort of get it right away, and others, they need sort of a gradual easing into the subject matter. So the previous line says here, the wisdom will survey the Dharma to be understood, distinguishing expedient and definitive, and different kinds of teachings, for implied, for indirect. So these are then different categories that we'll be looking at. But he says here, suchness is the nature of all things, abiding in 3 doors of perfect liberation. The meaning of this teaching is definitive. So that's where we talk about the absolute nature of things, where we come across teachings like the lack of characteristics of things, or the emptiness of phenomena, or how phenomena exist. You could say we arrive at the understanding of phenomena not as something we wish for or that exist on the basis of our intentions, but simply just things as they are. So that's definitive teachings. The other are those that then, you could say, help us along the path and enable us to approach this definitive nature. So that's where we have 2 categories of teachings. Okay, so here it says, Kangyur Rinpoche then says, and then now talking about the expedient teachings, taking as his frame of reference phenomena as they appear to deluded minds. In other words, everything occurring on the level of the relative truth. And in order to lead beings on the path, the Buddha referred to things that in truth have no existence. Thus, with regards to the ground, he spoke about the aggregates, the dhatus, and the ayatanas. Now, ultimately, when we look at all the various phenomena that we have, and particularly then when we look at our personal phenomena, which we, in the Buddhist jargon, refer to as the aggregates, the dhatus, and the ayatanas, meaning the mind and body, the experiences that we have, and the interaction between subject and object, and the consciousness that constructs what we experience. This is a science around the aggregates, what we call dhatus and ayatanas. The thing is, in the ultimate, these, if we analyze, they don't have any reality. And that's where you could say the Buddhist science is particular in that it, unlike Western science and Western philosophy, it acknowledges that nothing has any absolute enduring essence. Everything is a web of causes and conditions. And as such, appearances appear, yet they have no intrinsic existence. And that's where the Buddha, he knows that for us, things definitely have a very real, our experience of body and mind is very real. And so the Buddha talks about ayatanas, talks about dhatus and aggregates, simply just to map or to enable us to map and relate to our present experience. So that's where the Buddha talks about the ground in terms of these three. Then it says here, with regards to the path, he gave teachings on the three vehicles. So that's why, in general, in the Mahayana, when we say the three vehicles, we talk about Shravaka Yana, Pratyeka Buddha Yana, and Bodhisattva Yana. Again, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, when he talks about the three vehicles, the three yanas, he's more talking about what we normally refer to as the three vows, the Pratimoksha, individual liberation, the Bodhisattva vows, and the Vijayadhara or Vajrayana. But either way, that's then the path. And then with regards to the fruit, and I have to, this is a bit embarrassing, people, but I'm not sure it says here, he expatiated upon the three kinds of nirvana. Now, we might have the kind of nirvana that corresponds to the Shravaka, the kind of nirvana that corresponds to the Pratyeka Buddha, and the nirvana that corresponds to the Bodhisattva, possibly. But I have to say, I'm not entirely familiar with these terms. But the bottom line really is that in presenting these perspectives, the Buddha is really just doing that coming from a point of view of the experience of sentient beings and the way they experience, presently being confused, then to remedy this, taking a course of remedy, taking the medicine, that's the path, and then becoming perfectly healed, that's then nirvana. So the Buddha talked in terms of this, in terms of what we call ground, path, and fruition. Even though in the ultimate nature, phenomena, you could say the nature of phenomena, the basic nature of phenomena, dhamma dhatu, if you like, doesn't have that kind of this. These are all just, you could say the path is constructed to accommodate the experience that we as individuals have. So, Kangyur Rinpoche says, all these doctrines comprise the teachings of the expedient meaning. So that's also where we talk about cause and effect and karma and all these things. The scriptures that set them forth are the Pitaka of expedient meaning, meaning the basket of teachings or the body of teachings that accommodate this situation. That's what we call expedient meaning. And their commentaries are then the Shastras of expedient meaning. So that's then where we have the commentaries from the Pitakas refer to the Buddha's own words, and the Shastras are then the words from great masters like, for example, Nagarjuna or Vasubandhu and so on. The footnote here, the Padmakara people, they kindly kind of help us along the way here with a quote from Yönten Gyatso, and they say, and it says here, see the Akshaya Mati Nirdesha Sutra, where it says, what are the sutras of definitive meaning and what are the sutras of expedient meaning? The sutra taught with the purpose of introducing people to the path are the sutras of the expedient meaning. The sutras taught in order that they can engage in the result are the sutras of definitive meaning. Right? So we have those that talk about how we need to accumulate merit, how we need to practice the path, and so on. The sutras that describe the result or the definitive meaning are sometimes what we in Western philosophy call ontology. They're more about how things actually are, regardless of whether we understand it or not, simply just the way that things are. So that's where we, on the Buddhist path, we have a vision of how things are, but we also humbly take into account of how we misunderstand it. And that's where you say the difference between Buddhism and philosophy is that in philosophy, you just sit and you talk about how things, you have your theory about reality, ontology. But in the Buddhist teaching, we would say it doesn't really help to just know how things are, theoretically. There has to be a humble appreciation that for the time being, we don't get it. We are actually confused. And unless we actually align ourselves and integrate that understanding, then it just remains an image or a thought. So that's where it's essential that we have a path. And that's why it's not enough just to sit around and do philosophy. There needs to be the application of the path. And so that's where we have the path. What then expedites us, takes us there. So, but this is very important when we come across the Buddhist teaching that we can distinguish these two. People talking about emptiness, it's like you have these people here. Oh, I hear in the Buddhist teaching you don't believe in a self, but what is it that reincarnates? Huh? Yeah, that kind of, and that's where it's so important to understand what is it that we live with in terms of our confusion, which is our present reality, relative truth, and which is then what the expedient teaching talks about, and of course the fact how things actually are. So yes, there actually is no self, but it seems right now there seems to be a very real sense of self, and that of course is then what constitutes the subject of the path to deal with that confused condition. So it says here, those who understand the distinction between the teachings of the sutras of expedient meaning and those of the sutras of definitive meaning will know in which they should place their trust. The previous mention of the four reliances has made this clear. Now, last time we talked about these four reliances that are really very valuable. The first is don't rely on the person, rely on the Dharma, right? Don't rely necessarily on some individual, but rely on the teaching of the Buddha's teaching. So, you might have someone like me, for example. I would warmly recommend that you don't rely on someone like me, but on the Dharma that we're studying here, right? And then you might say, well, it's all in very strange, foreign cultural formulations, Yeah, that's the words, but try and understand the meaning. If there's sometimes in the teachings we'll talk about impermanence, and they might give some example of impermanence, in a Buddhist teaching, it might say, well, a house is not permanent. After 1,000 years, it will come apart. And that's where if you're a builder, you go, oh yeah, 1,000 years. I don't know if what I build is going to last 1,000 years. But that's in the old Tibet or in the old India when they built, the houses were built solidly, some of them at least. But that's where you could say sometimes there's a slightly foreign flavor to the teachings, but we have to look at the meaning. That's where it says, don't look at the words, look at the meaning. And that's also where then in that context, it says, don't look at the expedient meaning, look at the definitive meaning. Meaning don't just look at the teachings that are about method, but also look at what they're actually pointing towards. And finally, it says, do not rely on consciousness, rely on wisdom. And consciousness refers to this, you could say, ordinary dependent nature in its confused state. Don't rely on the ordinary conceptual dualistic mind. Rely on wisdom. Rely on that core of unconfused insight. So these are the four reliances. But again, that sort of makes it very clear the need to distinguish. So it says here, all this is the first key that opens up the treasury of the teachings, enable us to imbibe its rich and varied contents. So this kind of knowledge, this constitutes keys to understanding what are the Buddhist teachings. What is it that's being said? So we don't get stuck on that, Yeah, you said there's no self, but what is it that reincarnates? Ha ha ha. That sort of thing. I don't know if you ever come across that. So the implied teaching and the indirect teachings. Okay. So it says, when the nature of these two is clarified, implied and indirect instructions are explained as a means to grasp the expedient real intention. The first of these are only slightly overstated and open to interpretation. Their aim is not to lead beings in one situation only. Okay, so once we have understood the difference between the definitive and expedient teachings, we can go on to explore the latter, meaning, namely, the real meaning of which is not explicitly stated. So that's where we're now, you could say we could understand the definitive teachings, the fact that phenomena appear yet have no inherent true existence. All phenomena exist as a web of causes and conditions, praticca samutpada, and so on. But we also understand there are other teachings which are about us, enabling us to realize and understand things. And that's where we then work with the expedient teaching. So now we have some idea of where this is going. Then we can explore the expedient teachings. And that's where the real meaning is not talked about right there and then. It doesn't help to just right away say, oh yeah, all things is a web of dependent causes and conditions. It's all empty. Not many people would be able to relate to that. So that's where Kangyur Rinpoche then continues. He says, in order to assess both the Buddha's didactic purpose, what he's trying to teach, and the manner in which he teaches, and the content of his thought, his intention, what it is he wishes. The Tibetan is Gongshi, by the way, which some of you are familiar with, an organization called Siddhartha's Intent. That's what this is referring to here. The intention behind the Buddha, the wisdom. As these underlie the sutras of expedient meaning, and in order to establish a meaning that is ultimately valid, it is helpful to distinguish 4 kinds of implied teachings and 4 kinds of indirect teachings. So we're going to look at that. Don't worry. But that is where there's a number of teachings that we have which enable us to progress along, to enable us to understand more and more about the nature of reality. For example, impermanence. Impermanence is not an absolute teaching. It's simply just saying things are not going to last. What's compounded won't last. But that, of course, is because they don't have that their ultimate nature is empty. But for the time being, it's very helpful to just talk about things not lasting, the impermanence of things. There's a famous teaching of a woman who lost her child. And she went to the Buddha and said, Buddha, can you please bring my child back? And the Buddha said, I can't do that. And the woman was deeply distressed. And then the Buddha, to enable her to understand what was happening, it didn't help even to say, well, all things are impermanent. He said, go around in your village and ask for a sesame seed from every household where nobody has ever died. And the woman went around, and going through all the many households, she realized there was not a single household that hadn't experienced somebody dying. And through that, then she understood impermanence. Now here the Buddha wasn't giving an absolute teaching, but he enabled this woman to get a grasp and understand and gain perspective on what she had experienced. So then with regards to these 2 categories, implied and what is it again? Implied and What was the other one? Anyway, indirect. So he says, Kangyur Rinpoche says, we will begin with the 4 kinds of implied teaching. Here the Buddha merely expressed himself in words that were and are open to interpretation. The case is different within the indirect teaching, in which the Buddha taught his hearers by means of expressions employed on ad hoc basis, suited to the situation. So you can see the last one was very suitable to that particular context of this woman. The other one is more, you could say, instructional, general. So that's where the Buddha was skillful. And in general, also, you will see great teachers, very skillful to adapt according to the particular situation. So he says this was to lead them to an understanding of what he actually meant. It should be noted that in the case of implied teachings, although the underlying meaning is uppermost in importance, it may in fact elude the grasp of the hearers, even though the immediate purpose of the utterance is achieved. So again, in the case of this woman, it's not as if she would be, even though it did come from an understanding of the absolute nature, nevertheless, that would have been, you could say, the ultimate place for her to arrive at, then for the time being, simply just to alleviate her immediate experience of suffering and through an understanding, through wisdom, then that's where the immediate purpose is then achieved. Okay. Implied teachings. Oh, sorry. Yeah. 4 kinds of implied teachings have been taught, and all of them achieve the aim intended. Teachings that imply the equality of all phenomena reveal that even opposites are one. Some teachings which imply another sense reveal that if things are examined, they are found to be unreal. Teachings that imply fulfillment at another time declare the effortless achievement of enlightenment. Teaching given for certain individuals are intended to humiliate their arrogance. So these are then the implied teachings. Now, so the first of these, teachings implying the equality of all phenomena. Okay. In the most general terms, phenomena are, according to their fundamental nature, beyond the categories of good or bad. Okay? Here's a phenomenon, my watch. It doesn't it doesn't innately, is not innately good or bad. And anything we look around here in our world is not innately good or bad. Of course, if I'm late, I might go, yikes, I'm late. And then that's bad news, thanks to my clock. If I'm on time, I'm relieved. But it has nothing to do with the clock itself. If there's a landslide, it might bury animals and it might cause destruction. But in and of itself, the landslide doesn't have the idea, I'm going to harm so-and-so. If a plant grows and gives a wonderful fruit, it doesn't think, oh, I want to, make these people happy. Or if a plant grows a poisonous fruit, it doesn't necessarily in itself think, I want to be poisonous, a mean poisonous plant. It's on the basis of our relationship to phenomena that they gain the label good or bad. But we should, of course, respect that. And so we don't want to eat poisonous fruit. We want to make sure we're on time. We want to give people, nice fruits and all of that, even though phenomena in and of themselves are beyond good and bad. So we need to understand what we're talking about. Essentially, we could say when we talk about being free of good and bad, it's really just when we're talking about objectively things. But as far as how we engage with these things, whether we like them or not, whether if we give a gift to somebody, whether they will like them or not, that's all where the labels good and bad come in. But phenomena in and of themselves don't exist as such. So that's where Kangyur Rinpoche says phenomena are beyond any such differentiation. In this sense, the Tathagatas are all essentially equal, identical in the expanse of the Dharmakaya. So as far as the absence of confusion and the you could say full flourishing of all the enlightened qualities that are naturally present, spontaneously present within the ground nature, then all Buddhas are of one, you could say, are identical. So having this in mind, the Buddha said, at that time, I was the perfect Buddha, Vipassin. He was thus teaching that phenomena appearing as separate in time or as opposites, samsara and nirvana, good or bad, to be accepted or rejected accordingly, are all one. In addition, it was with these words that he confounded those who disparaged him for his short lifespan and size of his body. So apparently this is where there were those who would say, oh yeah, well, what's so great about the Buddha? He only lived, 80 years and, he wasn't that, his body wasn't that special and so on. So that's where there's a teaching which just talks about the equality of phenomena. 2, teachings implying the absence of inherent identity in phenomena. Now, this is where we then look at the Prajnaparamita or other teachings, also in the Yogacarya tradition, where we talk about the absence of something absolute in phenomena. So here it says let's just see what it talks about here. What's in Tibetan for that? Yeah, it just means absence of essence. Having another sense in mind, in other words, the absence of inherent identity with regards to imputed, dependent, and actual natures, the Buddha said that when phenomena are analyzed from form right up until omniscience, nothing is found. Thus, by appealing to analysis and so on, he counteracted the tendency to grasp at phenomena as real. Now, actually, what the Buddha here is talking about, and this is actually just since we mentioned it before, when we talk about these 3 natures, the dependent nature, the imaginary nature, or the perfectly existent nature, here they're actually referred to as slightly different. They're just referred to as the, what is it again? Imputed, dependent, actual natures. Then they don't have any reality as such. So. Okay. So that's where this is so important, because when we talk about these reference points in the teachings, such as the imputed, dependent, and actual natures, then we understand that they are taught as a reference for us to understand where we presently are in terms of the imputed nature of confusion and what the potential is, the actual nature of enlightenment, and dependent nature, the nature of the mind that is essentially subject either to confusion or to freedom, that they don't have an inherent existence. Those of you who study Yogacarya might be familiar with this, or rather the sort of discussion back and forth between the Madhyamika and Yogacarya, but forget about that just for the time being. Here then, there's a footnote where it says, the 3 natures or realities, Rangshin Sum, or sometimes also Mo Sum, are characteristic of the 3rd turning of the Dharma wheel, as discussed in scriptures such as the Samdhya Sutra. These texts are interpreted differently by the Chittamatra school and the Madhyamika school. Okay. That discussion we leave aside here. The point really is that there are teachings that are pointing to the fact that things don't have an inherent existence. And that is something where we could say operate with the assumption that presently then there is individuals that, as us, that suffer from the belief that there is something. And that's where then the Buddha says, when phenomena are analyzed from form right up to an omniscience, nothing is found. Thus, by appealing to analysis and so on, he counteracted the tendency to grasp at phenomena as real. So, see here, Mipa Rinpoche said that here the Buddha was speaking from the point of ultimate reality, not from the point of view of relative existence. So, of course, the Buddha is talking about something that is, you could say, belongs to the definitive truth, but in doing so, he's talking about the path or the process that leads us to understanding this definitive truth. And that's why we here are then teachings that imply this absence of inherent identity and phenomena. That's where we would say that is just one way of understanding absolute phenomena. That's one way. Teachings implying fulfillment at a future time, having in mind the fact that once the seed is planted, enlightenment eventually occurs at some future moment. The Buddha said that by the single recitation of certain dharanis or mantras, or by simply pronouncing the name of the Buddha, Nirmala Chandra Prabha, enlightenment would be effortlessly achieved. He said things like this in order to entice people who are otherwise slow and lazy in the practice of virtue. So that's where the Buddha would say, oh, if you do this, then eventually you will become enlightened, right? Well, that sounds familiar to most of us. And that's, of course, when we talk about the path. But that's, again, just expedient. That's saying that when this happens, you know, if you do this virtue, then eventually enlightenment will come about. Not saying enlightenment is right here, right now, sort of thing. Saying, you know, this is a process that we need to relate to. Okay, but see here. Mipam Rinpoche says, the Buddha did not mean that they would be born in Sukhavati immediately after their deaths. So it's not about, you know, that sort of rebirth talk. It's simply just implying that there's something might happen in the future. Okay, I'd like to actually stop here just to accommodate that there might be some questions. And yeah, let's just hold on. Okay. Are we good? Yes,
Yep. Sometimes in the mind training, they introduce emptiness as a first point, and then they get into the, well, I guess implied meaning or expedient, the training, the more relative meaning. And so I find that interesting sometimes too, how the path can be with relative and ultimate sort of introduced, and how ultimate truth can actually be a beneficial thing to know in the beginning sometimes.
Yeah, and that's actually also what is implied here, that you know, we say the paramitas, they don't really become paramitas unless there's prajna. So that's where also here we were talking about how we have the definitive meaning. And when we have a vision of that, that's actually what we call the view. Then when we have the view, then we apply the practice. For example, we might have the view that it's a good thing to be a compassionate person. You know, we can agree on that. But then the practice is to actually be patient and to be kind and so on. So we might actually say, it's a good idea to be compassionate, patient, and so on. That's our view. But then to practice it is then to be, you know, act like accordingly. Similarly, also to understand the absolute nature is what we begin with on the path, to have some understanding of that. But then, of course, when we are practicing the path, like you mentioned in the Lojong teachings, then we practice the various methods. In the case of the Lojong, like the slogan practice. In the case of the general path, you know, we then engage in the two accumulations of merit and wisdom and so on. But that's true, yes. So what you're pointing out there is really, you could say, the difference between view and then practice. Is wisdom, then Stanislav asks, is wisdom to be experienced, or is it just a label of experience? That's also a very good question. So we distinguish between wisdom that we can understand. We can, for example, understand impermanence. But even though we understand impermanence, somehow it just doesn't get in. A lot of us, we're getting older. And it's as if we're like, hey, what's this? I have white hair. You know, so that's where there's a discrepancy between our understanding and how it actually plays out. Similarly, also, we can understand wisdom. We can understand logically that phenomena are really just a web of dependent causes and conditions, dependent arising, and that they're empty. It's important to understand that we can understand emptiness intellectually, and that's what we call the figurative ultimate. I'm using Woolston and Helena's language. Sometimes it's called the enumerated ultimate. Sometimes it's called the categorized ultimate. But it just means that place where we have an understanding of what it really means that phenomena are empty. That's very helpful. But what we then need to do is, on the basis of meditation, is begin to relinquish our attachments to our ideas and our fixations and our rigidity. And that's where the obscurations become thinner and thinner. And that's where we become more and more open-minded, if you like. And that's where then genuine experience of wisdom begins to dawn. And that's what we then call the non-figurative ultimate, or the uncategorized ultimate. And that's experience. And that is then the scope of sublime beings. And that seeing of that emptiness is then what we sometimes refer to as arriving at the path of seeing. Yeah. Okay. Narayan, do you have more?
I notice you use energy instead of diligence for the fourth parameter. I found that interesting.
That's Trungpa. That's because Trungpa is sitting with a whole bunch of modern people who are probably opposed to the word discipline. You know, people from the northern coasts of Australia and the like.
So the second parameter after generosity, what's that usually defined as? Is it attention or is that discipline?
How is it we define this? We normally would say discipline is simply avoiding what brings suffering and engaging in what brings, you could say, progress on the path and happiness.
Whereas energy or diligence is more like the continual pursuit of.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was talking about that. That's discipline, right? But yeah, diligence. Yeah. Well, again, you know, there's the sort of the classical English idea of due diligence. You know, you have to work hard. The Protestant work ethic, that sort of thing. And that's where the implication of diligence, and where Trungpa Rinpoche uses energy and Tralik Rinpoche uses the word vigor. It actually, the Sanskrit is virya. And it's that kind of joy that you have when you're actually, you know, you're doing something and it's really working and you really feel like, yes, I want to keep doing this. You know, the plants are growing. I really want to nourish them and bring them manure, and, you know, I want to look after them. So it's not a slog. It's not like something we have to do. Yeah, that's the implication. Yeah.
I think it's really, really wonderful having that implied teaching and then the definitive meaning category, because, you know, there's those helpful sesame seed routes, and yeah, that ability is that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yes. No, in general, the Buddha is a pretty good, he's usually pretty helpful.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. We'll conclude with a few lines of dedication. Let's just see here. Oh, wait a minute. There's one more question to that. Oh, yeah, we covered that. Good. Okay. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the oceans of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.
Thank you, Jakob.
Thank you. Thank you.